Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cinema Wave podcast. We are here back again to talk about the penultimate episode of Star Wars' The Acolyte on Disney+. I am one of your hosts. My name is Darian Scalamoni. I am joined by Mark Jacobino, as always.
How's it going, Darian?
We're here to talk about Wookiees with metal detectors.
Yeah.
The name of the episode.
Jedi Wookiees.
Jedi Wookiees with metal detectors. No, this episode... Oh boy, this is gonna take us down this is something I was always worried about. Eventually having to do this again. The last time I feel like I've had to sit at this table and essentially shit on a show was quite a long time ago when Liz and I talked about The Idol, which has nothing to do with Star Wars, but that was the last show I felt this strongly about in terms of the story and the writing. And Mark said to me before we started recording that I fell for it because last week's episode, I thought there were some redeeming qualities in terms of giving Manny Jacinto's character the spotlight of Chimere. Mm-hmm. And at least some of the DNA and what was being pitched to Star Wars fans quite a long time ago when this show was first announced. At what year was that Star Wars Celebration? It was quite a while ago.
Yeah, and even if it was announced, it was just like the title. Like,
yeah, but it was also there was probably a log line or something, and they were talking about how so much of it was going to focus on the Sith in general, and that's not what this show is.
No.
And this episode in particular, you used the word in a text a text exchange we had earlier today. It's just a manipulative mystery, and that is very much what happens and what is happening in this show. And for the penultimate episode, which in a lot of cases is supposed to be like a real banger of an episode, like you really want to hook your audience, you want to get them psyched for your finale, and a show that already has so much working against it this season, this episode peters out. Like so much so that like I was on my phone watching it, which you don't want to be that person. I never want to be that type of person or that viewer. But there's so much wrong with what happens in this episode and in this show that we've echoed so many times. So if you guys want to go along for the journey and hate it along with us, watch it from the beginning. We started talking about this show, but your broad thoughts, Mark, on essentially is a retread of episode 3 that we get of this series.
Yeah, I want to point out to the viewers that every week Darian is always set up with a laptop. He's always ready with notes, and he's so like excited, even if he doesn't like something, to just dig into it. And this week he doesn't even have a laptop.
I have nothing in front of me.
That might be your new rating system. If Darian has a laptop open, the show deserves some credit or some.
I want to go deeper into the layers of it, but this show is like so vanilla, so cardboard that like
so bad.
I'm like I don't have a lot to say about this week's episode. Yeah, but we'll rant as we often do, unfortunately, with this show. But yeah, what were your thoughts even when you got to you posted on your Instagram about how even the end credits they managed to fuck up this week by putting like a pop synth song in the finale. And it's no disrespect to Victoria Monet, who's a fantastic music artist, but it does not fit.
It's not
Star Wars. It doesn't fit Star Wars at all.
Yeah, I said in my episode of my podcast, I said, I know where some of that $180 million went. It was to Victoria Monet to do a song that no one wants to hear in Star Wars. Broad thoughts on this episode. Just like you said, recycled content from episode 3. We get shot-for-shot scenes from episode 3 again here. And this episode was supposed to show a different perspective. And while we got some new perspectives, nothing really changed here. Everything stayed the same. This wasn't a revelation of an episode. I know a lot of people were like, wait and see the last episode or the last 2 episodes. Those will really tie everything together and the mystery will really have a nice twist to it. But I think this proves if a show isn't good or well written in the beginning or throughout the series, it's not just going to turn it around in the end and have some fantastic twist or mystery. It's got to be consistent, and this episode just proved everything that we thought it would be. So yeah, watching this episode, I didn't feel much. I did not enjoy this episode. Probably my least favorite episode, just because of the stakes of where we're at in the season. They have been talking about the whole new perspective on the Jedi. The Jedi are bad. They really messed up. Soul is so broken up over this. Master Torben literally killed himself over this. Took a vow of silence for 10 years and killed himself over this. And the big reveal, the big mystery, is that the Jedi were completely right to do what they did. And the only thing that was the problem was that the witches were the aggressors, and the witches were using dark magic, which we said in the beginning is, this is probably not good. This is probably a bad ceremony that's going on. And now we see that when the Jedi came to save Osha, you can argue that Soul picking sides with the twins might be an issue, but again, they weren't going to take May if May didn't want to go. They were like, we just want to take Osha. She wants to go. She told you she wants to be a Jedi. And it gets to the moment, and Mother Anase is like, oh, you think you're gonna come here and take my child after the scene before saying, okay, my my daughter, you can go. I support you. Then she's like, what do you think you're doing? You can't take our child. She turns into this mist black smoke monster. May is literally disintegrating, and Soul does what a Jedi does and protects the innocent, the weak, and he stabs her. And I think they were trying to send this really
shocking,
profound message, like, look at what the Jedi just did. And to drive that home, they had to get Mother Anase saying one last line, I was gonna let her go, even though you just said you don't think you can't take her, and you were just turning into a scary smoke monster. Like, what part of that wasn't gonna provoke something out of the Jedi? So Leslie Headland, I understand she had a vision for this, and maybe it didn't translate. I know there were some tweets from the writers that said Disney basically said, you need to keep the episode to 30 minutes. You can't go over this. You need to cut this episode short. So understand that, as with most things with Disney Star Wars nowadays, the boardroom is in the creative circle, and that's never going to end well. And I'm sure that happened here in the show, but Leslie Headland's vision did not translate here. The Jedi don't look worse, and the reason that they do the things in this episode is because she's like telling us how bad they are, but not showing us. Like the reason to cover up this whole thing at the end of this episode just makes no sense. We took the girl that wanted to be a Jedi, the other sister started a fire, and it essentially spiraled from there. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't understand why they thought this would be some like profound study of the Jedi, when in the end it once again proved that, yeah, it's exactly what we thought from the first couple episodes. So.
Yeah. I think that so much of the problem of what the show is too, though, is the two lowest rated and what the ones that are probably being talked about the most in terms of the worst episodes are this episode and the one that this retreads. I don't think the stuff with the Coven works, but even on top of that, I think the stuff with the twins is not translating, and having the series revolve around these twins that are supposed to be this significant thing is not translating to viewers either, and you're not caring about these characters. The biggest shock for me was, like you were saying, at least they were building a little bit of momentum going into this episode, and you completely take Chimere out of the equation. And even the stuff with Soul at the end of that episode, where you see like him putting May in a compromised position, and then so is this supposed to represent him retelling it, and it's just playing out visually for us to see it, even though we already knew 85% of what came in this episode? That's a very poor story mode to do and to present to your audience. There's just so much in terms of the production of the show that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
On top of the fact that the show reportedly costs $180 million, the best thing about this show is the fight choreography, and you get some really great fight choreography in this episode too, but you can still get good fight choreography in shows that cost a lot less.
Yep.
And the thing that is also troubling is, like, you look at a show like House of the Dragon, which you came on and talked about this week for this past week's episode. And that's an expensive series too, but it does cost reportedly less than what the Acolyte is costing. And it looks a lot better. It's able, like, there was one example that I had seen online where they were talking about the way that Harrenhal looks and how they do a really great job of establishing just how tattered and disgusting and broken down this place is. Meanwhile, like, everything in where the Coven is just looks muted. It looks plain.
Yeah.
And it's like, where are you spending your budget? Especially on top of, and this is no disrespect to any of the stars that are in the series. They're not noteworthy names where you're you're paying an actor $20 million.
Right.
You don't have Hugh
Right.
Jackman
No.
coming
No.
into the Star Wars universe in which you're kind of
Mhm.
spending all your money on actors. I'm sure Lee Jung-jae coming off of Squid Game must have cost them a little bit of money, but it couldn't have been anything massively significant. This is the first American project that he's done.
Yeah.
So that's also troubling to me because it's like, all right, well, when you finally have the resources available, despite the fact, listen, you and I have gone on rants, especially in regard to the runtime. I don't understand why that was a mandate. I worry that it's like Disney being like TikTok culture. You got to keep things short. That hasn't proven to work anyway.
No.
But you're gonna lower the run times of a series and give them 180 million. So that's gonna translate to how many millions per episode in
Yeah.
an
It's
8-episode
money per
series.
episode. Yeah.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. But even in terms of the story structure, with the constraints you may have had, you could have basically crafted a better story.
Big time.
Revolving the story around the twins has been problematic so far.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel similar to that or if it's something in which, because there's a lot of poor things, unfortunately, with the series, but
Yeah.
I think that some of the criticism could be laid on the fact that they're kind of buoying so much of the series on the shoulders of these twins. And Amanda's fine in the show. I don't think they're bad. The younger actors I don't think are great.
Mhm.
But now you have 2 or 3 episodes that feature them, and so much of this story where your supporting characters might be a little bit more interesting. Some of them don't even get a lot of screen time, like
Yeah.
Jessica Brown Finley from The Matrix. So
Mm.
I don't know if you feel similar to that or where you kind of lean with May and Osha leading this story was pitched as something different.
Yeah,
Because it
well,
was initially.
Yeah. Well, we talked about in the beginning the manipulative structure of the show. This episode really should have just been in line with episode 3, and we should have gotten kind of the whole picture within the first couple episodes so that we understood May's motivations. So we know, like, that's a good motivating factor. We see that Soul drops her on purpose, and she has that hatred brewing, and
And she sees that he kills her
she
mother.
sees that she
So
kills-
there's
yeah.
definite like you're saying, you could have done this 4 episodes ago.
Yeah.
And it would have made sense for her particular journey, and we could have felt for her character a lot more
Mhm.
going forward
But
for the rest of the series.
we just never did. She was never likable. She was never empathetic. And now seeing what actually happened and the fact that it wasn't anything shocking or revealing, they just use this flashback or this mystery as a way to stretch out the time and get people to be like, oh, well, I want to know what happens. I want to know what happens. And now that we finally know what happens, it's like, that was not worth it. So they should have just put all of this story in the front end. Then we would understand the table of where the characters are, why they're doing what they're doing, and then moving forward, you can have an interesting story of, you know, the Jedi and Osha and May, and over time maybe May or Osha gets a hold of one another, and then May can tell Osha what happened and what she saw, and then Osha's kind of put in this area where she's like, oh, well, do I trust Master Soul? He was my master for a while. Or do I trust my sister who I thought was dead? And they could have just been a lot more creative with it. But as we've said a million times, they've been very manipulative with the story structure to just get another week of Disney Plus subscriptions and just stretching it out and out and out. So yeah, when you have a mystery show where the mystery happens and it was never a mystery at all, it's a failure.
Yeah. Do you think they're going to do something even crazier with a potential twist in the last episode? Because so much of the show, even though it's a mystery, is predictable, like we've talked about. I wonder if they're going to completely...
They gotta have at least one twist, right? One twist that hits. But
yeah.
Leslie Headland has said, I mean, she said plenty of things off camera and in interviews. She said there's more Sith in the show that we're gonna see. It's more than just Kumir. So at this point, last episode, they have to do something with the Sith, whether it's good or whether it's even like a significant piece of it. We'll see. But I think at this point, there's no room to give this show any leeway anymore. Next week, I have no confidence that it's going to be anything that mind-blowing or interesting. Maybe Kumir gets a nice send-off or something. But I just, like you said with the first question you asked about May and Osha, that's what's next week is really going to be the payoff.
Yeah.
So if we're not interested in the two main characters that the main payoff is going to be about next week, I don't see it being a very well-received finale.
Yeah. Even in terms of Jodie Turner-Smith's performance, which I think in the third episode we excuse me, we were praising.
Who's that?
That's Mother Anastasia.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I
she's
think
good. Yeah,
I
she's
think in
good.
context, in this episode, they actually make her look worse because of the writing,
Yes.
which you talk about.
Agreed.
And that's not necessarily, that's unfair to criticize her acting. I don't think it's her acting in a sense. But so much of that manipulation of retreading the same things that we had already seen, it feels like they don't know what they want to do. And that might not be the case, but like, again, I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago. It feels like part of it is like trying to dumb things down for your viewer, where you're like, I don't think you really understand what happened in episode 3. Let's give it to you from a different perspective, and we're going to try to replay the exact same thing that happened, but also show you a little bit more of the Jedi.
Yeah.
Which also, I don't know if you felt similar, I feel like these are the dumbest Jedi we've ever seen in the history of Star Wars.
Yep.
For the most part.
They don't feel like Jedi. We already made the joke about the metal detector in the ground with the Wookiee, but when you think about the Jedi and you think about the purpose that they're there to find this vergence in the Force. And they say it's a concentration of Force energy. So you would think that Master Jedi, 3 of them, not just like one Padawan and one Master, 3 Master Jedi couldn't work together to meditate to find this vergence in the Force. That's kind of what we always see Jedi do. These Jedi feel very watered down as a version of the Jedi. And again, I think it's because they were trying to send this message of, oh, we want to bring the Jedi down a peg. Like, that's the theme of the show. And in doing so, they just made the Jedi dumber and a watered down version of them instead of doing something more interesting and compelling with the story around them to test their beliefs and all that. Instead, they were just like, well, let's just make the Jedi look bad for the sake of looking bad. I talk about it in my episode. The Clone Wars didn't change the Jedi. It just used the Jedi that they had in the prequels and had politics and war around them, and you see how that changes them. In the Acolyte, they don't even feel like Jedi. They don't meditate to find the Force. Torben cries because he wants to go home the entire episode, which, I mean, you could be like, well, he's a teenager, but like, is that really supposed to be like a
it's
compelling...
not representative of what the Jedi are supposed to embody.
And even worse is that he becomes a master. So like, his journey continued, and that means if you become a master, you have to face all of the things that gave you issues when you were a Padawan. That's how the progression works. You go from a Padawan to a Jedi Knight where you're given more responsibility, and then your trials are where you face adversity and and then all of the things that have burdened you in your life, whether you lost your parents or like, all of these trials are what you have to overcome in the Force to become a master. So we're just saying that Torben just became a master and he didn't deal with any of this trauma. That doesn't feel genuine to the Jedi. So yeah, I mean, like you said, the Jedi just feel extremely watered down in this show for the sake of sending this message that the Jedi are somehow always been really flawed and bad.
Yeah. Where do they go from here? Because it's hard to look at this episode and have any redeeming quality to it necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, I did talk about the fight choreography. There is a really great fight scene between Kelnaka, Torben, and Soul. And eventually we get
Master Andara.
Yes, Master Andara comes in.
Yeah.
Thank you. But other than that, there's not much to take away from this episode, especially because so much of it is retreading what we've seen previously. Obviously, we're gonna jump back into where we were for episode 6 with the finale. At least we have to continue on, especially with Osha putting on Kymir's helmet.
Yeah.
So we have to see obviously how that plays out. But I know, even though I was a little bit more optimistic about that episode, you still felt, I think you felt it was one of the better episodes, but you were still mostly underwhelmed.
For sure.
So in your opinion, like, where do you go from here? Where do you want to see? I mean, again, where do you want to see them go? You're probably like, I wish the show just fucking didn't happen.
I think I'll do it the way the Acolyte's been doing it. Next week, somehow Master Soul will put it together where the Master is, where Kymir is. He'll somehow figure that out because we're just full of conveniences. Whether he'll look into May's brain or whatever, like, he'll find out how to get there. They get there. There will be Osha and Kymir, and then it'll be Soul and May, and there will be some sort of conflict. Soul will have to not only admit what he did now to May, but he'll have to admit it to Osha, or we'll see how May takes this, because now Soul just told her that he killed the mother because he thought she was about to kill Osha, because Soul thought that was Osha, not
Yes,
May.
yes.
So he's telling May, like, I thought less of you in that moment, and I let you fall and die. At least he thought he did. So the way that May has been so unstable this entire series, I don't know how she's going to take that, but she's flip-flopped 1,000 times, so maybe she'll be like, I appreciate your honesty, Master Soul. Let's go get my sister. and then we'll get to this planet with Chimere and Osha, and yeah, I think there'll just be some sort of showdown on this planet that is very convenient and forced.
Underwhelming. Yeah.
And yeah, I'm less optimistic about what they'll do with Chimere. I think he may like divulge into a very typical villain in this last episode instead of being more interesting, and it'll just be like, okay,
Do you think
great.
even after Leslie Headland's comments that there's supposed to be more with him in a potential season 2?
I don't know how they're going to do a season 2. If it's not going to get greenlit, if it is, then I have no hope for anything that Disney is doing in live action if they think that they can just get this greenlit to season 2. Yeah, I don't know if she meant by the season 2 being like a look back at Chimere, because they're obviously not afraid to do flashback episodes or move around the timeline. So I'm curious if that's the way they go with Chimere in season 2. If there's a season 2, I want to stop saying season 2. I don't know. I really don't know what they're gonna do to end this.
Okay, my last question for you in regard to, before we get to the finale next week.
Sure.
As someone who's read a lot of the High Republic novels, and this being the first look for casual fans.
Terrible.
I know that.
Yeah.
But give me your, because I want to give you your platform right now.
Sure.
A lot of people seem to really love those novels, you being one of them, and what they managed to establish, taking us to a time that we didn't previously know about in Star Wars. Now, this show is trying to be representative of that, and it obviously is not doing a good job.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that emotionally as a passionate Star Wars fan? Are you frustrated? I'm assuming yes. And how would you like to see them fix this potentially after this series?
Yeah.
Because they're putting themselves, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot with what they're doing with the Acolyte. So just want to give you that platform to talk about how you feel about it, because I do think it's important to see the perspective of somebody that is passionate about that world, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think it was a marketing tool at this point. Now seeing the entire show, it was a marketing tool to say, oh, look at this new era that we've built up before. It not only makes people that love the High Republic get really excited for the Acolyte, but it makes people that were excited for the Acolyte get excited for the High Republic books, and then they buy books, and then it's like a circle. I think that's a good thing. I think that's the good thing, to go see the Acolyte and be like, oh, well, I want to see more of the books because this is bad and the books are really good. The High Republic, for me, just showed the Jedi in a perfect sense of they had the ability to fail and make mistakes, and they were also extremely human. They felt like people, but they still upheld those Jedi beliefs. One of the main characters, Elzar Mann, he does something terrible in the first phase, and he deals with that for the next phase. Right now, we're currently reading the current book that's out called Temptation of the Force, and it's his ghost. He did something terrible, and he's still a Jedi Master. He wanted to leave the Order. He wanted to run away from the thing that he did, and now he's still reeling from that. And all of the Jedi throughout the High Republic are challenged in their own ways and in their own belief system, and it's just such a hopeful story in a age of such like violence, and so many terrible things are happening in the galaxy. The one point that I can give this episode is they do mention the hyperspace disaster. It was a throwaway line, it was quick, but they do say this planet was lifeless because there was a hyperspace disaster. The hyperspace disaster they're referring to is the kickoff of the High Republic book series. So I was like, oh, okay, so they called it out. But I love the High Republic because it shows the Jedi to still be those heroes, but it shows that they could be more human than maybe what we saw in the prequels. The prequel Jedi were very stoic and very, we had some warm Jedi like Obi-Wan, but even Obi-Wan was extremely dogmatic at some points. Anakin was too emotional, too much on the human side where he couldn't balance those emotions. But the High Republic, I felt just nailed that middle road, and that's why I loved it as a bridge, and the potential that this show had to bridge that gap of how did they go from these really human feeling characters that still followed the way of the Force, and did a nice balancing act, and how did they get to here? And the books started to explore that with the Jedi and the Republic working a little bit more closely together, but they weren't one at that point. And I thought that this show was going to be showing, hey, how did they go from these two separate entities to becoming one force for the Republic, and having the Jedi forget that they're supposed to follow the will of the Force, not the will of the Republic. Um, so I love the High Republic. I recommend it to anyone that's a Star Wars fan. Check it out. The first book is called Light of the Jedi. It is a nonstop thrill ride. It's sad, it's dark, it's action packed. It has these really hopeful moments. It explores the Force in really interesting ways. Um, they have the Jedi see the Force in different ways. It's a thing that they introduce in the novels. So one of the main characters, she sees the Force as like a symphony. So every character and every living being is a chord or a
That's
piece of
cool.
music. Elzar Mann, who I talked about, sees the Force as an ocean, the tides moving in and out, stormy seas and stuff like that. Um, and it's just such an interesting exploration of the Force. Whereas here, we have the thread, and that's really cool. Like, I agree that there should be different views at the Force and what the Force is to different people. Um, but there's just no magic to it. There's a not a literal magic, but there's a magic to the way the Force is talked about in the original Star Wars, and it's beautiful, it's hopeful, it's this amalgamation of religion in our world where you can be Hindu, you could be Buddhist, you could be Christian, but you can watch Star Wars and understand like the Force is that higher power,
Yeah.
and everyone can connect to it. But this show hasn't tapped into that tangible feeling of Star Wars. I haven't felt it, like, at least throughout any of the things that we've
Yeah.
seen
Yeah.
so far. Whereas with Ahsoka, even though it ended and I wasn't happy with how it ended and the way it wrapped up, there were still moments throughout those first 5 episodes where I was like, that's Star Wars right there. Like, I could identify it. Acolyte's probably the first show where I was just like,
It doesn't feel like Star Wars.
I got nothing.
Yeah, I think the one redeeming quality for someone who hasn't read the novels that you could at least maybe have some hope going forward, but you would need to obviously you're gonna have a whole new creative team because I can't imagine Leslie Headland working in Star Wars again. But um, this takes place towards the back end or the very end of the High Republic, and all those things that the books are talking about happen. What, like within 100 years before that, or throughout that time?
Yeah.
So I think that there is room. Obviously, I mean, it's a galaxy far, far away. This is the thing, obviously, too, that a lot of people talk about, where it's like you want to work within these different facets of this ginormous galaxy that we don't see enough of. So much of it is interconnected to the Skywalkers, and I was hopeful with the show.
Mm-hmm.
I was hopeful from the perspective too of like only hearing great things about these novels and saying, "Oh, this would be cool to see them play in a different era and see how we got from point A to point B."
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, this show isn't succeeding in that regard. Yeah. I don't know.
I think what they could do is just take a book, take a page out of the book of other series that are based on source material and just adapt the books. Like, I know it might feel lazy, but like, Disney is having a very tough time with coming up with original ideas, and I think they should. Why not go into that catalog of books? Like, I think people forget that Star Wars is just an ongoing mythology, that there's no template of like what's come before or anything like that. Like, Marvel, there's thousands of comics to make stories from, and DC, Harry Potter, like, all of these things are based on other things. Star Wars, they're just throwing stuff at the wall.
Yeah.
So why not reach into those books, bring them to a broader audience, give them their flowers.
Even the video games. I feel
Even
like
the video games,
the
yeah.
more recent ones, like Jedi Survivor, I know people were
Cameron
a huge fan
Monaghan's
of.
great. Like,
Yeah.
he could totally do a great job on the big screen. And I've advocated for them doing an animated show that follows the High Republic, because it's so expansive, it's so big that, as we could see, $180 million doesn't look that great in Disney's hands. So I would be very skeptical that they could pull off that scale in live action. So, lean into animation, which I've always advocated. Star Wars animation has never fallen off like the live action has. The Bad Batch, I I didn't love it, but it still felt like Star Wars. And in the end, it had a nice wrap up and it had some really fantastic storylines and themes. Um, but I know Disney is like they'll never look at animation like that, even though it's the medium that built their entire corporation.
Yeah, I wonder what is Filoni's perspective on the novels and things like that. Do you know?
He's really into him. I mean, the Night Sisters, like you told me that one time, like he brought those into Clone Wars because those were from the novels. A lot of the stuff in Clone Wars that he brought in from the outside were like based on novels, or at least like loosely based on novels. So he loves them. I mean, any big Star Wars fan now, like they during that period where there wasn't Star Wars between 83 when Return of the Jedi came out and 99 when Phantom Menace came out, like the books were all they had.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So and the video games, but the books were what people had. So if you see a big Star Wars fan right now, likely they loved that expanded universe novels, and Dave Filoni's one of them. I know Leslie Headland is probably one of them too. I don't doubt that she's a huge Star Wars fan, but I just don't think her vision panned out the
Yeah,
way she maybe wanted
I
it to.
agree, and I like I said, I'm so curious on how the end result kind of came to be with this series, especially based on that. Because I know you bring up Marvel too, and like even with Marvel and the way they do storytelling in film, they'll adapt a comic, but they won't adapt a comic like page for page,
Right.
which I think is great. They're still implementing their own ideas within it, but still following the themes of what that comic and that character represents. And I think that, I mean, again, so much of what the Acolyte is too is all new characters essentially, besides Vernestra, right? Like for the most part.
Yep.
So giving you that clean slate of having all these characters that don't exist in the novels might not necessarily be a good thing. Like you might want to associate people with characters that they've seen previously. I mean, think about all the fanfare Rosario got when she appeared as Ahsoka for the first time. So I don't know where Star Wars goes from here. I mean, we've talked about it constantly on the podcast. I don't want to dive too deep into it this week because next week we're going to talk about the finale and what that means for Star Wars going forward, especially in this era, if they ever play there again, or it might be quite a while until they play there again. And because the next series we're getting from Star Wars is going to be back to where we're at with Mando and Ahsoka with Skeleton Crew, which who knows if it even exists. We've joked about that so many times, but
comes out in 5 months apparently. So I haven't seen a lick of footage.
Exactly. We haven't seen anything yet. I mean, Comic-Con's next week, I think. I have a feeling
that would coincide with like Acolyte ending, them showing the next
I can see
sense.
something like that happening, and if that happens, obviously we'll talk about it, but I don't know if there's much else to talk about in regard to this episode and the show right now.
No, I mean, we could just dive into the little stupid things that happen, but I don't think it's
I don't think it's worth it. My laptop isn't in front of me, so I deem that it's not worth it. But no, it's disappointing. It's obviously unfortunate, and even as I associate myself as like a casual Star Wars fan, I still root for Star Wars. I wanna live in this world when it's good. I mean, I loved the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. I adored Andor, and I think that there are some redeeming qualities to certain. I mean, even Ahsoka, like there were certain things that we really enjoyed about it when we did talk about it, but a lot of it just feels underwhelming right now, and that's not what you want out of this galaxy that means so much to so many people. So I don't know where we're gonna go from here, but Mark, if you just want to plug all your socials and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, sure. So I do the Star Wars Mark of Balance podcast, do a bit more of the deep dive into like the lore and more deep dives into the episodes themselves, breaking them down and whether it fits in the framework of Star Wars and what George Lucas established. I talk about books as you can see, TV, movies, video games, anything in the Star Wars galaxy I'm talking about. So you can follow me on Instagram at @star_wars_ Mark of Balance if you want to hear more of my thoughts on the Acolyte or anything else. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Absolutely. And we love having you here every week to talk about Star Wars. Even if the show isn't necessarily great, I love getting your perspective every week, and I know the fans do as well. So thank you guys for checking this episode out. Be sure to like this video if you guys can and comment your thoughts about what you think, not only about this week's episode, but we'd love to have a conversation about what you guys are thinking about the show in general this whole entire season, because I know that majority of people aren't enjoying this show, but there are some fans of it, and I don't want to shit on people for having their opinion, but I am curious on why people like what they're seeing, because it's hard from our perspective to get that, but it always is important to see the other side of it. So we'd love to have a conversation with you guys in the comments, and you guys can subscribe to us. We have the Culture Wave Media Network. We cover everything movies and TV here on the channel, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So please be sure to subscribe. You could also follow us on social media. We are at Cinema Wave Media and @_Culture Wave Media on Instagram, as well as at Cinema Wave Media on TikTok and Threads, and just Culture Wave on Facebook. Just signing off, I am Darian Scalamoni.
I'm Mark Jacobino.
And we'll see you guys next time.
This is the culture.